You don't belong here. Margaret Winchester's sneer cut through the hushed first-class cabin like shattered glass. Sandra Bullock froze, her paperback trembling in her grip, not from shame but fury. Passengers held their breath. No one dared move. Then a voice from the aisle, calm and lethal. Problem? Every head turned. Hollywood icon stood motionless, his gaze locked on Margaret. The cabin erupted in whispers. Before we continue, drop a comment if you've ever dealt with a Karen like Margaret. But this showdown had started hours earlier.
Hours earlier, in the glossy first-class lounge at LAX, Sandra Bullock faded into her corner, unnoticed. The lounge buzzed with muted conversations, a scattered chorus of clinking glasses, and the faint echo of boarding announcements. Margaret Winchester entered as if she owned the place, her diamonds glinting like weapons as she claimed her throne at a prime table. Sarah, her companion, hovered nearby, clearly used to Margaret's self-importance. A flight attendant rushed over with a practiced smile. Margaret snapped her fingers, half lifting her bejeweled wrist, and demanded champagne. The good one, not whatever's cheapest. The attendant nodded swiftly, scurrying off to fulfill her request. Sandra, seated a short distance away, wore simple black leggings, a loose sweater, and running shoes. Her hair was tucked under a baseball cap. A paperback novel rested in her hands, pages held open with soft, steady fingers. She wanted a break from the Hollywood glare, so she kept her head down. No red carpet glam here, just comfortable anonymity. Still, Sandra's fingers brushed a locket under her sweater, her mother's last gift. A subtle movement, almost protective. Kindness outshines diamonds. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. It was a reminder she carried everywhere. A man in a black jacket lingered at the bar, sipping a glass of water. Sandra caught his eye, a flicker of recognition, but he vanished before Margaret noticed. The lounge lighting reflected off his short dark hair, but his face faded into the background as he stepped away. Unaware of this near interaction, Margaret tipped her head back in regal disdain, scanning the room as though she expected lesser mortals to curtsy. Ugh, Margaret muttered to Sarah, sneering in Sandra's direction. Sweats, a baseball cap, sneakers. Did we wander into some discount airport lounge by mistake? Sarah's eyebrows lifted apologetically. I don't know, Margaret, she whispered. Maybe she's traveling incognito? Margaret's laugh was harsh enough to turn heads. Incognito? Didn't realize Oscar winners shopped at Walmart. Did they run out of designers in Hollywood? She sipped her champagne with a flourish, pinky pointed high. Sandra remained focused on her book, though she definitely heard the barb. The man in the black jacket hovered at the periphery, half listening, half watching. Margaret's voice dripped with contempt. First class was once an exclusive experience, she said loudly. We paid for a certain atmosphere, not a free-for-all where anyone waltzes in. Sandra turned a page without comment. A few other lounge guests exchanged nervous glances. The flight attendant returned, placing another drink by Margaret's side with trembling hands. Margaret barely acknowledged her. In a quieter voice, she continued to Sarah, people these days think money alone grants them access. But real class? There's a world of difference. And apparently no one's teaching them. Across the lounge, Sandra inwardly sighed. She despised scenes, but Margaret's words bristled against her sense of fairness. Fiddling with her locket, she reminded herself to stay calm. The man in the black jacket, seeing Margaret's sneer, clenched his jaw. Still, he made no move. At last, the boarding announcement crackled over the PA. Sandra stood with graceful economy, tucking her paperback into her modest backpack. Margaret stood too, chin tilted upward, unaware that a storm was brewing, one with consequences she'd never anticipated. Sandra and Margaret reached the desk for first-class boarding simultaneously. Sandra offered her ticket with a polite nod. The gate agent checked it, recognized her name, and said, "Enjoy your flight, Miss Bullock." Sandra stepped forward without fanfare. Margaret, right behind her, lifted her eyebrows in mock astonishment. Bullock. Ooh, are you that actress who wore those dreadful outfits on the red carpet a while back? She feigned sincerity, her voice pitched for other passengers to hear. A few travelers paused, glancing over. Sandra turned, annoyance flickering across her face. I'm Sandra Bullock, yes. Margaret let out a theatrical laugh, pulling Sarah close enough to share the moment. Then you should know, dear Sandra, that when you fly first class, you dress first class. She gave Sandra's leggings a deliberately slow once-over. Or did you forget you're among people who take these amenities seriously? A hush fell around them. Sandra took a breath. I'm comfortable. Thanks for your concern. Margaret smirked, stepping forward to hand over her own ticket. Comfort is one thing, respect for the privilege is another. Sarah tried to look anywhere but at Sandra, whose nostrils flared slightly. Any actress worth her salt knew how to maintain composure, but Margaret's deliberate jabs were wearing thin. They proceeded down the jet bridge. Margaret trailed close, voice lowered but still audible. And to think, an Oscar winner can't afford something nicer than Walmart chic. Surprising. Sandra pretended not to hear. She focused on her breathing, inhale, exhale, determined no meltdown would happen before they even boarded. Margaret soon found her seat in the first-class cabin, directly across the aisle from Sandra's. She stowed her designer luggage with great flair. Sarah slumped beside her, looking trapped. Meanwhile, Sandra calmly placed her backpack in the overhead bin, then settled with her book. The flight attendant offered pre-flight drinks. Margaret waved imperiously. "Champagne for me, no fruit juices, please." She cast a sidelong glance at Sandra's plain water glass and shook her head. It's almost insulting to see someone so oblivious to the standards here. Margaret crossed one leg over the other, letting her stiletto heel dangle in the aisle. Her diamond bracelets jingled with each smug movement. Nearby, a few passengers, recognized business travelers, exchanged uneasy looks. Sensing tensions were already high. Margaret smirked, unaware her next insult would go viral and cost her everything. With final boarding complete, the cabin doors sealed. Flight attendants began delivering safety instructions. Sandra concentrated on the pamphlet in front of her, knowledge she'd seen a million times but found oddly grounding in the moment. Margaret, though, wasn't finished. She looked around to ensure she still had a captive audience. Then she tossed a remark at Sandra, loud enough for nearby rows to catch. It's a pity they let anyone pay their way into first class. Used to be an indication of refinement and true distinction. Now it's just money. Sandra's spine stiffened, but she wouldn't dignify that jab with a response. She turned a page of her paperback, eyes scanning the text, though her mind churned with frustration. A young couple across the aisle whispered to each other, eyes darting between Margaret and Sandra. Several recognized Sandra's face. They also saw the hostility emanating from Margaret's seat. Phones were discreetly lifted. Perhaps a screenshot, a short video, maybe an overheard snippet of Margaret's vitriol, just enough to feed social media. Margaret noticed one passenger's phone aimed in her direction. Rather than take it as a warning sign, she reveled in the attention. She tossed her hair. Let them watch, she thought. If anything, she relished the stage. "You should lighten up," Sarah whispered, leaning closer to Margaret. "This could blow up in our faces." Margaret snorted. "Blow up? Don't be ridiculous. I'm saying what everyone else is thinking, but it's too polite to say." The flight attendant came by with a tray of hot towels. Margaret yanked one perfunctorily. Sandra accepted hers quietly, wiping her hands. The two women locked eyes for a brief moment. Before Sandra could speak, Margaret pursed her lips in a condescending smile. "Don't worry, dear," Margaret cooed. "If you can't keep up with the dress code, maybe next time you'll remember what first class is about, presentation, not pajamas." Sandra clenched her jaw. Before she could retort, the aircraft's engines roared to life, pressing everyone back into their seats. A tense hush fell. Not even half an hour later, seatbelt signs still on, Margaret decided she'd been silent long enough. She leaned into the aisle, ignoring a muted glare from a passing flight attendant. Her crisp, designer blazer and luxurious scarf screamed money, but her behavior screamed something else entirely. "You know," Margaret announced, "I read a piece once that said the truly elite carry themselves with grace. I guess Hollywood executives don't pass that memo around." She side-eyed Sandra. Sandra exhaled slowly. No meltdown yet, but the tension in her shoulders was clear. She touched her locket again. "Kindness outshines diamonds," her mother's words. If only Margaret realized how hollow her insults were. In the row ahead, a figure stood up. Hollywood icon. He turned around, revealing that quiet, unmistakable presence. Several passengers gasped or whispered excitement at recognizing him. His gaze fell on Margaret first, measuring her. Then he addressed Sandra with a gentle smile. "Hey, Sandy," he said. "Didn't see you in the lounge." His tone was warm, but underneath there was a steely edge. Sandra looked up, relief flickering in her eyes. "Hey, Hollywood icon, good to see you." Margaret's face blanched. She had been so consumed with attacking Sandra that she hadn't noticed Hollywood icon in the same cabin. The man from the black jacket earlier. That was him all along. A swirl of embarrassment and resentment churned in her gut. Hollywood icon's posture was relaxed but purposeful. He nodded politely to a few staring passengers, then turned fully to Margaret. She might have recognized him on sight if she hadn't been so preoccupied. His eyes flicked to Margaret's diamond-studded bracelet, then back to her face. "Is there a reason you're giving my friend here a hard time?" he asked quietly. Margaret let out a tiny scoff, rallying a shred of bravado. "I wasn't giving anyone a hard time. I simply noted that some of us appreciate first class more. Seriously." Hollywood icon's eyes darkened. He hadn't said a word, yet the moment felt electric. Hollywood icon stood in the aisle, politely letting a flight attendant pass. He folded his arms, each movement controlled, like a coiled panther deciding whether to pounce. Meanwhile, Margaret refused to show fear. She plastered on a brittle smile, leaning back in her seat. She pointedly surveyed Hollywood icon's attire, a simple black jacket, no flashy designer labels. She sniffed. I guess you and your friend have a similar dress code, casual. Nothing wrong with that if you're, say, on a road trip. A hush swept the nearby seats. One passenger half lowered their phone in shock at Margaret's boldness. Hollywood icon's name was legendary for kindness and unassuming humility. Few people dared to belittle him to his face. He arched one eyebrow. It's comfortable, he said, eyes never leaving Margaret's. I don't remember reading a rule that you need armor to sit in first class. Margaret's nostrils flared. Armor. He referred to her lavish jewelry and meticulously curated outfit. Well, maybe your memos get lost in Hollywood too, she fired back. Though I'd expect more from a big star, especially one who's playing bodyguard to Miss Bullock. Here. A soft wave of murmurs rose among the passengers. Sarah shrank deeper into her seat, pretending to read the safety card. Sandra closed her eyes briefly, inhaling for calm. Hollywood icon's voice was quiet. Sandra can handle herself, but I don't enjoy bullies. Margaret's diamond bracelets glinted as she drew herself up. I'm merely stating facts. Standards matter. True class matters. And let's face it, Hollywood is hardly a beacon of class these days. He regarded her with a slight tilt of his head, as though examining a bizarre specimen. I've fought worse villains than you, he said, referencing a glint of his iconic action roles, and they had better comebacks. A ripple of laughter spread through a few onlookers. Margaret's cheeks grew hot. She sensed that the comedic edge to Hollywood icon's retort had left her the butt of the joke. Seizing what little dignity remained, Margaret snapped, I'm not a villain. I'm a paying customer demanding the experience she deserves. That's not villainy, that's entitlement. Hollywood icon's gaze sharpened. You said it, not me. Margaret's lips twitched in frustration, but she forced a sarcastic half-smile. Well, if you're so keen on saving the day, maybe you can buy Miss Bullock a decent wardrobe. Clearly, her costuming department missed a memo. Sandra bristled. That was the line too far. She parted her lips to speak, but the flight attendant abruptly interrupted, pushing the drink cart between them. Excuse me, Mr. Hollywood Icon, Miss Bullock, ma'am, could I offer a refreshment? We have a selection of... Hollywood Icon stepped back to let the attendant pass, lips pressed in a thin line. Margaret, though, looked triumphant, as if she scored a point. Inside, Margaret's heart pounded. She was playing with fire, but she couldn't stop. Part of her thirsted for validation. Perhaps if she could win this confrontation, it would legitimize her worldview. Yet a gnawing doubt whispered that she was on the wrong side of an unstoppable wave. As the flight cruised above the clouds, cabin lights dimmed to a flattering glow. A few passengers tried to watch in-flight movies, but too many were enraptured by the Margaret versus Sandra saga. Some stealthily recorded bits. Margaret felt the weight of eyes upon her. She gave a regal toss of her hair, determined to control the narrative. If people wanted drama, she'd give them drama. Sandra, who had endured far more than she ever cared to, finally set her book down with deliberate calm. She leaned across the aisle, her voice controlled but resonant. Margaret, is it? You keep talking about standards in class, but my mother used to say, class isn't bought, it's earned, and you've earned nothing. Margaret's self-satisfied expression faltered, replaced by wariness. Excuse me? Sandra's eyes flashed. I've heard your insults. You're proud of your designer clothes, your expensive jewelry, but have you ever paused to consider that real class is about how you treat others? Margaret sniffed dismissively, though her voice sounded a touch uncertain. Spoken like someone who can't afford better. Sandra's mouth tightened. Oh, I could wear couture if I wanted to, but I don't need a label to prove my worth. I've worked with people across the globe who have a fraction of your money but 1,000 times your decency. A hush stole over the cabin. Even the soft drone of the engine seemed to fade as the confrontation escalated. Sarah blinked nervously, inching her tray table upright, as though preparing for an emergency landing of dignity. Margaret clenched her fists. You talk a big game, Miss Bullock, but maybe, just maybe, you're hiding that you don't belong here. You and your buddy Hollywood Icon might fool the tabloids, but I see right through you. Hollywood Icon had stood again, quietly. He placed a steady hand on Sandra's shoulder. She patted it, signaling she was okay, then addressed Margaret directly. You can insult me all you want, but I'm done letting you bully this entire cabin with your sense of superiority. Margaret bristled, eyes darting around to see who might come to her defense. The nearest businessman avoided eye contact. The young couple looked sympathetic towards Sandra, and Sarah studiously examined her nails. Sandra added, her voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow cut the air, "You keep bragging about how hard you worked, but you show no respect for anyone else's journey." A forced laugh escaped Margaret. "It's not my job to pat every underdressed passenger on the back. Besides, true refinement used to separate first class from thee," Sandra interrupted. "My mother taught me class isn't bought. It's earned, and you've earned nothing." Margaret's mouth hung open, stunned by the bluntness. The hush in the cabin was absolute. A few passengers broke the silence with quiet applause, and Margaret's face darkened. She realized she was losing her grip, but how far would she sink before hitting bottom? Margaret's control slipped further with each passing second. The plane soared through calm skies, but the social storm in first class raged. She shot Sandra a poison-laced glare. "I don't care what your mother said," she spat, voice trembling. "You want to feel superior because you wear sneakers like you're above dressing well? That's not class, that's laziness." The hush from onlookers felt almost ominous. A flight attendant stood frozen mid-aisle, uncertain if intervening would help or backfire. Hollywood icon took a slow step forward. His posture was relaxed, but power radiated from him. "You're missing the point," he said softly. "Sandra's shown more class in ignoring your insults than you have in delivering them." Margaret tried a haughty laugh, but it faltered. "And you, mister, I've fought worse villains than you. Gonna pull a stunt from one of your action movies? Maybe matrix me into submission?" Hollywood icon's eyes crinkled. "More like remind you that respect is earned, not forced. If I thought you'd listen, I'd say you can still walk this back with dignity. But you seem intent on burning bridges." Margaret's pulse raced. She despised how easily he read her. Lowering her voice, she said, "Dignity? I treat these flight attendants better than any of you do. I just expect them to do their job." A male passenger behind her quietly coughed, clearly disagreeing. She ignored him. With a heavy sigh, Hollywood icon turned to the flight attendant. "I apologize for this tension. You're doing a great job." The attendant gave him a grateful nod, her cheeks pink. He then fixed his gaze on Margaret again. "Maybe start by respecting the staff since they're not your servants." Margaret's hand twitched near her scarf. She felt a swirl of shame but quickly masked it with defiance. "I'm not a monster." Hollywood icon gave a small nod. "Your actions say otherwise." Those words landed like a direct punch to Margaret's pride. She glimpsed phones discreetly angled in her direction. People were capturing everything. Fear gnawed at her. What if this goes viral? That was the real horror. Not guilt over her cruelty yet, but a realization that the world might see her meltdown. Her carefully curated social image could be annihilated. She forced her defiance to the surface. "Then so be it. If telling the truth makes me a villain, I'll wear that label proudly." Hollywood icon shook his head, disappointment etched on his features. "A shame," he murmured, stepping aside to let the flight attendant pass. Sandra clutched her locket, brow furrowed as she battled both anger and compassion. Kindness outshines diamonds, she reminded herself, but enough is enough. An hour into the flight, the cabin was tense. Some people feigned sleep to avoid the drama. Others pretended to watch a movie but peeled off their headphones whenever Margaret or Sandra spoke. Sarah scrolled on her phone, biting her lip. Margaret felt the slow burn of wounded pride, but behind that was a rising tide of panic. She noticed how many phones were turned her way. She recognized the hush of anticipation that meant gossip, possibly a social media explosion. Sighing, she crossed her arms. "Sarah," she whispered, "check if there's anything online about this." Sarah hesitated, then typed rapidly. Moments later, she exhaled shakily. "You might want to see for yourself." She showed Margaret a short clip already posted under the hashtag #FirstClassKaren. Someone had caught Margaret's lounge remarks about Oscar winners at Walmart. The post said, "Karen versus Hollywood icon is the showdown we needed. #FirstClassKaren." Margaret's face drained of color. She breathed, "No, no, no, no." 1,000 worst-case scenarios flickered through her mind. Her social circle would see this. Business contacts, neighbors at the country club. She'd be ridiculed. She risked a glance at Sandra, who was quietly reading. That calm. How is she so calm? More and more, Margaret realized Sandra and Hollywood icon possessed something unshakable, real self-assurance. They didn't need to attack or flaunt. They knew their worth. The seatbelt light pinged off, and Margaret, needing air, stood. She wandered toward the galley, eyes twitching with panic. A flight attendant, the same one she'd snapped at, turned to face her cautiously. Margaret began, swallowing her pride. "I wanted to say sorry if I was rude earlier. It's just, I'm used to a certain standard." The attendant, obviously surprised, managed a polite smile. "No problem, ma'am. Would you like some water? Margaret nodded, taking the cup with shaky hands. This small acceptance of blame felt excruciating, yet strangely necessary. She retreated to her seat, nearly colliding with Sarah, who discreetly updated her. More posts are popping up. People are loving how Hollywood icon basically called you out. Pressing her eyes shut, Margaret muttered, I can't believe this. She paused, then in a rare moment of vulnerability whispered, Did I maybe go too far? Sarah's silence was answer enough. Margaret sank into her seat, dread swirling in her chest. She took a sip of water, letting it cool the heat of shame radiating through her. At last, the confrontation had forced her to ask the unthinkable, Am I the problem? But the biggest moment was still to come. Sandra had one final push for Margaret's awakening. Time crawled toward descent. The cabin lights brightened as flight attendants prepared passengers for landing. A few diligently filled out customs forms or checked connecting flights on their phones. Yet the drama in first class remained the main attraction. Margaret tapped on her phone, refreshing social media. With each passing minute, new tweets surfaced, sky-high views. Yo, hashtag first class Karen meltdown is insane. Can't believe she tried shading Sandra Bullock in a sweater, LOL. Movie fanatic, Hollywood icon basically said, I've fought worse villains than you, and they had better comebacks. A legend. Hashtag first class Karen. Hashtag Hollywood icon knows classy travels. Don't be like hashtag first class Karen. Diamond bracelets can't buy common decency. Her stomach turned. She'd always believed she was admired for her impeccable style and high-status lifestyle. Now thousands, maybe millions, were laughing at her. She thought, maybe I deserve it. The admission tasted bitter. At the same time, Sandra quietly closed her book and looked Margaret's way. The seatbelt sign dinged on as the plane began final approach. Hollywood icon, seated ahead, stretched his arms before leaning back, serene as ever. Margaret swallowed her ego. Miss Bullock, she said, voice low, strained. Sandra, She struggled to form the words. I have been unforgivably rude. I guess I got carried away. Sandra studied her face, trying to gauge sincerity. It's one thing to say it, she said gently. Another to mean it. Margaret's eyes flicked to her phone, still buzzing with condemnation from strangers. I do mean it. I didn't realize how I sounded. A flicker of empathy softened Sandra's gaze. We all mess up. Words can sting, especially when they come from a place of hate or insecurity. My mother always told me kindness is a better companion in life than cruelty. Margaret pressed her lips into a line, blinking fast. She nodded once, too choked up for a real response. Sarah squeezed Margaret's hand, relief rounding her shoulders. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing, Flight attendants, prepare for landing. The plane began its gentle descent. Through the window, city lights glittered like scattered jewels. Hollywood icon turned, giving Margaret a measured look. If you've really changed your tune, you'll show it once we land too. Not just to Sandra, but to the people you treated like props. Margaret felt tears pricking her eyes. She gave a faltering nod, realizing she needed to apologize to the flight attendants who'd tiptoed around her earlier. Maybe she'd do more than that, maybe. She'd reflect on her entire approach to life. By the time the plane touched down, hashtag first class Karen was trending worldwide. Passengers pulled out phones, scanning updates. Some quietly gushed over the epic showdown between Karen Margaret, real-life queen Sandra Bullock, and action icon Hollywood icon. Exiting the plane, a handful of onlookers craned for glimpses. A small wave of camera flashes from the terminal made Margaret flinch. She parted ways from Sarah momentarily, who whispered, Let's just hurry through baggage claim. Sandra and Hollywood icon, stepping off first, nodded politely to the pilot and crew. Ambient chatter echoed in the jet bridge. Sandra paused to glance behind her, as if to see if Margaret would follow. She saw Margaret inching forward, newly subdued. As Margaret passed the flight attendants, she mustered a stage whisper. I'm so sorry for the trouble. A few nodded graciously, not wanting to prolong the awkwardness. Outside the gate, bright airport lights illuminated every grimace, tear, and forced smile. A smattering of fans recognized Sandra and Hollywood icon, calling for selfies. They offered quick, polite greetings. Meanwhile, Margaret stood just aside, phone in hand, face ashen. And that's how hashtag first class Karen learned the biggest lesson of all. Money can't buy you respect and cruelty can't earn you class. By the time we landed, social media was ablaze with her insults and Hollywood icon's iconic clapback. She walked away with shame, but maybe also a chance to change. The camera in a hypothetical YouTube narrative zooms out over the bustling terminal as Margaret drifts alone, overshadowed by the kindness and self-possession radiating from Sandra and Hollywood icon. Smash like if you're team Sandra and Hollywood icon, What would you do if you faced a hashtag first class Karen? Comment below and subscribe for more real-life drama.